The snow began falling on January 12, 1719, as 30,000 Swedish soldiers prepared for what they believed would be a simple march home. Within weeks, most of them would be dead, frozen in the Norwegian mountains in one of military history's most catastrophic retreats. This is the story of the Carolean Death March, a disaster so complete that it effectively ended Sweden's era as a European superpower. To understand this tragedy, we must first travel back to the winter of 1718, when Sweden's warrior king Charles XII lay dead in a muddy trench at Fredriksten fortress in Norway. For nearly 2 decades, this enigmatic monarch had led Sweden through the Great Northern War, fighting against a coalition that included Russia, Denmark, Poland, and Saxony. Charles XII was a military genius, but also a man seemingly addicted to warfare. He had spent almost his entire adult life on campaign, turning Sweden into a militaristic state that existed primarily to feed his endless wars. The king's death changed everything overnight. The siege of Fredriksten was immediately abandoned, and the Swedish forces, numbering around 30,000 men, found themselves in hostile Norwegian territory with winter closing in. These weren't just any soldiers. They were the legendary Caroleans, named after their fallen king, considered among the finest infantry in Europe. They had marched across continents, survived the brutal retreat from Poltava in 1709, and had become legends for their discipline and endurance. But now they faced a different kind of enemy. The Swedish commanders quickly realized their precarious position. They were deep in Norwegian territory, supplied by a network that was already straining under the winter conditions. More critically, they were surrounded by a hostile population that had endured decades of Swedish occupation and warfare. Every Norwegian farmer, every village, every mountain pass represented a potential threat. The decision was made: retreat to Sweden immediately, before the Norwegian forces could reorganize and before winter made the mountain passes completely impassable. It seemed logical. The direct route through the Norwegian mountains to the Swedish border was only about 150 kilometers, perhaps a week's march under normal conditions. But these would not be normal conditions. The retreat began in late December 1718, just weeks after Charles XII's death. The army was organized into several columns, each taking slightly different routes through the mountain passes. The largest column, commanded by General Carl Gustaf Armfelt, consisted of around 6,000 men and followed what they believed was the most direct route through the tidal pass. From the very beginning, the signs were ominous. The winter of 1718 was proving to be exceptionally harsh, even by Scandinavian standards. Temperatures plummeted far below normal, and snow fell in quantities that old-timers claimed they had never seen before. The narrow mountain paths that were treacherous enough in summer became death traps covered in ice and snow. But the Swedes pressed on. They were Caroleans, after all, soldiers who had survived the Russian winter during the retreat from Poltava. They had endured hardships that would have broken lesser men. Their officers maintained strict discipline, their supply trains were organized, and their morale, despite their king's death, remained relatively high. The first deaths came within days of entering the mountains. Soldiers began falling out of formation, unable to keep pace as the cold sapped their strength. The lucky ones were helped by their comrades or loaded onto the few remaining carts. The unlucky ones were left behind, promised that rescue parties would return for them once the column reached safety. No rescue parties ever came. As the march continued, the weather worsened dramatically. What had been merely bitter cold became a killing freeze. Contemporary accounts describe temperatures so low that exhaled breath would freeze and fall to the ground like snow. Weapons became so cold that touching them with bare skin would tear away flesh. Men's beards froze solid to their coats. The supply situation deteriorated rapidly. The pack animals began dying from the cold and exhaustion, meaning that essential supplies had to be abandoned or carried by men who were already struggling under their own equipment. Food ran low first, then ammunition, then even basic items like blankets and extra clothing. But it was the snow that proved the greatest killer. This wasn't the light, powdery snow of a typical winter storm. This was wet, heavy snow that fell continuously for days, accumulating to depths that swallowed men whole. The narrow mountain paths that were treacherous enough in summer became death traps covered in ice and snow. General Armfeldt's column faced the worst of it. By January 10, 1719, they had been marching for over 2 weeks and had barely covered half the distance to the Swedish border. Men were dying hourly now, not just from the cold, but from exhaustion, starvation, and what we would now recognize as severe hypothermia and frostbite. The general faced an impossible decision. They could continue forward hoping to reach Sweden before the entire column perished, or they could try to retreat to Norwegian territory and surrender to enemy forces. Either choice likely meant death for most of his men. Armfeldt chose to press on. January 12, 1719, marked the beginning of what survivors would later call the White Hell. A massive blizzard struck the mountains, bringing with it winds so fierce that men could not stand upright, and snow so thick that soldiers literally could not see the man in front of them. The temperature dropped to levels that froze exposed flesh within minutes. The column disintegrated. Units became separated in the whiteout conditions. Officers lost contact with their men. Soldiers wandered off the path and disappeared into the snow, never to be seen again. Some men, driven mad by cold and exhaustion, began throwing away their weapons and equipment, stripping off their clothes in a final fatal act of hypothermic delirium. The few surviving accounts describe scenes of unimaginable horror. Soldiers found frozen solid while still marching, their bodies preserved in walking positions by the instantaneous freezing. Others were discovered huddled together in groups, having died while trying to share body warmth. Entire companies simply vanished, leaving only scattered equipment and weapons to mark their passing. By January 15th, Armfeldt's column had effectively ceased to exist as a military unit. Of the 6,000 men who had entered the mountains, fewer than 500 were still alive and capable of movement. The general himself was suffering from severe frostbite and hypothermia, but he continued to lead his dwindling band of survivors toward the Swedish border. The other Swedish columns fared no better. The units that had taken alternative routes through different mountain passes encountered the same killing cold, the same impossible snow conditions, the same complete breakdown of military organization and discipline. Some columns lost even higher percentages of their men than Armfeldt's force. On January 17th, the surviving remnants of what had once been a proud army finally stumbled across the Swedish border. Of General Armfeldt's original 6,000 men, fewer than 400 had survived. The general himself died within hours of reaching Swedish territory, succumbing to the frostbite and exhaustion that had been slowly killing him for days. Across all the Swedish columns, the casualty figures were staggering. Of the approximately 30,000 men who had begun the retreat, only around 5,000 survived to reach Sweden. That represents a casualty rate of over 80%, one of the highest in military history for a single operation. Entire regiments had been wiped out completely, leaving no survivors to tell their story. But the Carolean Death March represented more than just a military disaster. It marked the effective end of Sweden as a major European power. These 30,000 men represented the core of Sweden's professional army, the veterans who had made the country a feared military force for decades. Their loss, combined with the death of Charles XII, left Sweden unable to continue its aggressive foreign policy. The political ramifications were immediate and severe. Sweden was forced to sign a series of humiliating peace treaties, giving up vast territories to its enemies. The Baltic Empire that Sweden had spent a century building collapsed almost overnight. The country would never again play the role of a major military power in European affairs. Perhaps most tragically, many of the deaths were completely unnecessary. The Swedish commanders had chosen to retreat through some of the most dangerous mountain passes in Norway, believing they offered the quickest route to safety. Alternative routes existed, longer but far safer. The decision to prioritize speed over safety had cost 25,000 men their lives. The Norwegian population, despite decades of Swedish occupation, were horrified by the scale of the disaster. Local farmers and villagers did what they could to help the survivors, often at great risk to themselves. Some Norwegian families sheltered Swedish soldiers for months, nursing them back to health, despite the fact that these same men had recently been occupying their country. The discovery of the frozen bodies began in the spring of 1719, as the snow melted and revealed the full extent of the catastrophe. Entire companies were found frozen together, their bodies perfectly preserved by the cold. Weapons, equipment, and personal belongings were scattered across miles of mountain terrain, creating a macabre trail that marked the army's final march. Many bodies were never found. They remain in the Norwegian mountains to this day, entombed in snow and ice in remote locations that may never be explored. Occasionally, hikers still discover artifacts from the retreat, a sword, a helmet, sometimes even human remains emerging from a glacier or a melting snowfield. The Carolean Death March became a powerful symbol in both Swedish and Norwegian national consciousness. For Sweden, it represented the tragic end of their age of greatness, the moment when their military might was broken forever on the mountains of Norway. For Norway, it became a reminder of the terrible cost of war and the power of their harsh natural environment. Historians have studied the retreat for centuries, trying to understand how such a catastrophic loss of life could have occurred. The factors were numerous: unusually severe weather, poor intelligence about mountain conditions, inadequate supplies, and perhaps most critically, the decision to prioritize military expedience over human survival. Modern survival experts who have studied the march note that the Swedish soldiers made many of the classic mistakes that still kill people in extreme cold environments today. They underestimated the severity of the conditions, failed to adapt their tactics to the environment, and maintained military discipline even when that discipline was counterproductive to survival. The tragedy of the Carolean Death March extends beyond the immediate military and political consequences. It represents one of history's clearest examples of how quickly human plans can be overwhelmed by natural forces. These were experienced soldiers, led by competent officers, equipped with the best gear available in the early 18th century. Yet within weeks, they had been reduced to scattered bands of dying men, defeated not by enemy action, but snow and cold. The march also illustrates the brutal reality of pre-modern warfare, when armies lived and died by their ability to move across hostile territory. Without modern weather forecasting, reliable maps, or emergency rescue capabilities, military commanders were making life and death decisions based on incomplete information and optimistic assumptions. Today, the route of the Carolean Death March is marked by memorial stones and monuments scattered across the Norwegian mountains in locations where large numbers of Swedish soldiers died. These simple markers serve as reminders of one of military history's most devastating retreat and of the 25,000 men who never made it home from their final campaign. The Death March effectively ended the age of Swedish military dominance in Northern Europe, but it began something else. The modern understanding that nature, not enemy armies, represents the greatest threat to military operations in extreme environment. The lessons learned from this disaster would influence military planning for centuries to come, as commanders gradually came to understand that fighting the weather could be deadlier than fighting human enemies. In the end, the Carolean Death March stands as a testament to both human endurance and human folly, a reminder that even the finest soldiers, led by experienced commanders and motivated by national pride, can be reduced to nothing when they challenge the raw power of winter in the world's most unforgiving mountains.